Chapter 1. The Unexpected Night. Captain Daniel Vega, commander of the Galactic research vessel Horizon, stood at the center of the most critical exploration mission in the galaxy. After months of near isolation, navigating the mysterious space surrounding the new star system Zeta Terra, the crew was on edge. Their latest discovery, a barren yet oddly structured planet, was creating tension among the scientific team, and Daniel had to keep everything under control. Though known as a stoic leader, respected by both human and alien members of the crew, even he wasn't immune to exhaustion. Tonight, after hours of combing through complex reports and reviewing hypotheses on the planet's origins, Daniel finally took a moment for himself. He rarely allowed himself time to relax. Most of his evenings consisted of poring over galactic maps, calculating possible threats, and determining the safest routes for his team. But tonight was different. For the first time in weeks, Daniel gave in to the fatigue. He removed his standard-issue Galactic Fleet uniform and slipped into a more comfortable undershirt and loose shorts. The fabric was cool against his skin, a small luxury in the otherwise sparse ship quarters. It was a moment of brief relief, something he had long forgotten could exist in space. His thoughts began to drift toward the planet they were orbiting, its eerie stillness, the ancient, forgotten ruins they'd spotted from above. Something about that planet didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't quite pinpoint why. Before he could dwell on the odd feeling, the mechanical hiss of the door to his room interrupted his thoughts. It opened before he could react, and standing there, as if frozen in shock, was Teria. Teria, the Andralis mate assigned to his ship, was an unusual figure. Unlike most species the Galactic Fleet encountered, the Andralis had a mysterious air about them. They were known for their beauty, intelligence, and rigid customs, particularly surrounding privacy and interaction with their superiors. Teria's presence on the horizon was one of those long-standing traditions of respect between humans and her kind. She was supposed to assist with simple tasks, but she did so with a grace and precision unmatched by any other crew member. Teria's silvery skin shimmered slightly under the room's dim lighting, her tall and lithe frame casting a shadow across the doorway. Her large, reflective eyes widened as she took in the sight before her, Captain Daniel, casually dressed and relaxed, something she had never seen before. "Captain, I didn't mean," she stammered, her normally calm and composed voice filled with an unfamiliar tension. Her species was strict about observing personal boundaries, and the sight of her superior in such an unguarded state was clearly a breach of protocol. For a moment, Daniel was just as stunned as she was. Teria had always been a quiet and reserved presence, rarely speaking unless necessary and always keeping to herself. Yet now, she stood before him, visibly flustered, and it was something he had never expected from her. Teria, it's okay," Daniel finally managed to say, his voice softer than usual. "You just caught me by surprise." Teria's cheeks flushed a pale lavender, a rare sign of embarrassment for her species. She quickly averted her gaze, her hands trembling slightly as she moved to step back through the door. "I apologize, Captain Vega. I did not intend to intrude. No, it's fine, really," Daniel reassured her, more amused than annoyed by the situation. He waved his hand dismissively. "You weren't expecting to find me like this. I get it." But Teria didn't leave. She remained rooted to the spot, her gaze flicking between the door and Daniel, as if torn between protocol and some internal struggle. In a moment of vulnerability, Daniel sighed and leaned against the edge of his desk. "Teria, we're out here in deep space, far away from everything we know. Maybe we could all use a little less formality once in a while, don't you think?" Teria blinked, clearly uncertain how to respond. For her, this level of casual interaction with a superior was almost unthinkable, a breach of centuries-old customs that her people held dear. But there was something in Daniel's expression that made her pause, an unspoken invitation to let her guard down, if only for a moment. "I suppose so, Captain," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel smiled, an attempt to ease the tension. "Look, if you need something, you can speak freely. You don't always have to be so formal with me." She hesitated for a moment, her delicate features betraying a hint of curiosity. "Is that really allowed?" Daniel chuckled. "It is if I say so. Come on, Teria. We've been working together for months. I won't bite." That seemed to break the ice, at least a little. Terria's posture relaxed, though she remained cautious. Very well, Captain, but it is still unusual for me. My people have strict customs when it comes to interactions like this. I know, Daniel said, nodding, but we're not on your homeworld. You can relax. For the first time, Teria allowed herself a small smile, though it was brief. I shall try. But as the awkwardness began to fade, something else crept into the room in unspoken tension, thick and lingering. Daniel couldn't help but notice the way her eyes flickered toward him, as if seeing him in this state made her reevaluate something. And for Teria, seeing her commanding officer in such a vulnerable moment brought up emotions she couldn't easily suppress. Before either of them could say more, the ship's intercom crackled to life, breaking the moment entirely. Captain Vega, we've detected an energy signature on the planet's surface. You may want to see this. The voice of his first officer, Lieutenant Ramirez, echoed through the room. Daniel straightened up immediately, the weight of command settling back on his shoulders. Understood, Lieutenant. I'll be on the bridge shortly. Teria, sensing the return to formality, gave a slight bow. I will take my leave, Captain. My apologies for the interruption. But as she turned to go, Daniel felt a strange pull, a lingering sense that this encounter had been more significant than either of them realized. Teria, he called after her, his voice soft but firm. She stopped, looking back at him with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. We'll talk later, Daniel said, a promise hidden in his words. About everything. With that, she gave a slow nod, her eyes lingering on him for just a moment longer before she disappeared through the door, leaving Daniel alone in his room, the air between them charged with something neither could quite define. Chapter 2. The Discovered Secret. Captain Daniel Vega stood on the bridge of the horizon, his sharp eyes locked onto the data display in front of him. The energy signature they had detected was like nothing he had seen before. It was coming from beneath the surface of the planet. They had been studying a planet that had shown no signs of life or significant energy sources during the months they'd orbited it. Yet now, an anomaly was clearly present, and it was growing stronger by the minute. Lieutenant Ramirez, give me a full analysis, Daniel ordered, his voice steady. Lieutenant Ramirez, a seasoned officer with a penchant for detail, tapped rapidly on his console. His dark eyes flicked across the readouts, his brows furrowing in confusion. It's strange, sir, Ramirez muttered. This energy reading doesn't match any known pattern. It's not natural, that's for sure. But it's also not typical of any technology we're familiar with. It's almost like a pulse growing stronger, then weaker, as if it's alive. Daniel's brow furrowed. An energy source that felt alive? That was unsettling. His mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Had they stumbled upon some ancient, dormant technology? Or worse, had they awakened something far more dangerous? He turned to Teria, who had quietly entered the bridge and taken her usual station, monitoring environmental systems. Her presence was even more noticeable after the awkward interaction they had shared earlier in his quarters. She hadn't spoken a word about the incident, but Daniel could feel the subtle shift in their dynamic. Teria, any indication of biological life forms in the area of the signature? He asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Teria's slender fingers danced over her console, her eyes narrowing as she concentrated. After a moment, she shook her head. No, Captain. No biological traces detected. The planet remains as desolate as before. However, she paused, biting her lip, an unusual gesture of uncertainty for someone as composed as she typically was. What is it? Daniel pressed, sensing her hesitation. The energy readings. They seem to fluctuate in a way that almost resembles brainwave patterns, Teria said, her voice quiet. But I've never seen anything like this before. It's not quite like a living organism, but it mimics something sentient. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Sentient energy? The idea was almost incomprehensible, but then again, they were in uncharted territory. He glanced around the bridge, reading the unease on his crew's faces. Whatever they were dealing with, it was far beyond their expectations. Commander Vega, Ramirez interrupted, we need to make a decision. This signal is getting stronger. If we don't investigate, we risk losing control of the situation. Daniel nodded. He knew Ramirez was right. They couldn't just sit here and wait for something to happen. If the energy source grew too powerful, It could pose a threat to the ship and to the entire crew. But sending a landing party down without more information could be equally dangerous. He glanced at Teria once more, her calm demeanor masking the clear tension in her posture. Ever since their encounter earlier that night, Daniel had noticed a subtle change in her. Something was different between them now, something unspoken but undeniably present. But he couldn't let that distract him from the mission at hand. "Teria," Daniel said, his voice firm but not unkind, "you're coming with me on this one. I want your expertise down there. Whatever we're dealing with, I'll need someone who can think outside the box." Teria blinked, her surprise evident. "Captain, of course. I'll prepare immediately." There was no room for debate, and Daniel wasn't about to entertain any objections. He needed her sharp intellect and her unique perspective as an Andralis. Her people had knowledge and insights that could prove invaluable, especially when dealing with something this unknown. As Teria left the bridge to ready herself, Daniel turned back to his first officer. "Ramirez, you'll be in charge while we're down there. Monitor the situation closely. If anything changes, you contact us immediately." "Understood, sir," Ramirez replied, his tone resolute. "But be careful down there. Something about this doesn't feel right." Daniel couldn't agree more. Something about this entire mission felt off. But as the leader, it was his responsibility to face it head-on. The landing shuttle touched down with a soft thud on the dusty, barren surface of the planet. The atmosphere was thin but breathable, though Daniel and his team kept their helmets on as a precaution. The horizon stretched out endlessly, barren and devoid of any life or movement. But in the distance, the source of the energy signature pulsed, a faint, glowing light just barely visible through the swirling dust. Teria stood next to Daniel, her tall, slender form poised and alert. She had donned her tactical suit, a sleek, form-fitting outfit that offered both protection and mobility. Her silver skin seemed to shimmer under the weak light of the planet's sun, and despite the tension of the situation, Daniel found it hard not to notice the graceful way she moved. He quickly shook off the thought. Now is not the time for distractions. "Captain, the energy signature is approximately 500 meters in that direction," one of the crew members, a scientist named Dr. Kellen, said, pointing toward a jagged formation of rocks. "It's intensifying the closer we get." "Let's move," Daniel ordered, his voice calm but commanding. As they approached the rock formation, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something they weren't prepared for. The air grew colder, and the strange pulsing energy seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet, making it feel almost like a heartbeat. Teria, walking beside him, remained silent, but Daniel could sense her unease. Her people had a deep connection to the energy flows of the universe, and whatever this was, it was clearly unsettling her. When they finally reached the source of the signal, what they found was both incredible and terrifying. Embedded deep within the rock was a massive, crystalline structure, glowing with a strange, pulsating light. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The crystal seemed to hum with energy, and as Daniel stepped closer, he felt a strange pull, as if the crystal were calling out to him. This is ancient," Dr. Kellen breathed, his voice filled with awe. "I've never seen anything like it." But before anyone could react further, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The pulsing of the crystal grew stronger, and a strange light began to emanate from its core. It wasn't just energy, it was something else. Something alive. "Teria, what's happening?" Daniel shouted, his voice barely audible over the rumbling. Teria's eyes were wide, her usually calm expression replaced with fear. "It's waking up," she whispered. "Whatever it is, it's waking up." And in that moment, Daniel realized the terrifying truth. They hadn't just discovered an ancient relic. They had awakened something far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. Chapter 3. The Awakening. The trembling intensified as the ground beneath them began to crack, sending shockwaves through the planet's surface. Captain Daniel Vega, always steady in a crisis, immediately barked orders. "Everyone, fall back to the shuttle. Now!" he shouted over the rumbling earth. His team moved quickly, but as they turned to retreat, Daniel noticed something unusual. Teria wasn't moving. She stood in front of the crystal, her silver skin illuminated by the pulsating light, her large eyes locked onto the ancient artifact as if in a trance. The vibrations from the crystal seemed to resonate through her, and for a moment, Daniel saw her features flicker with an emotion he couldn't place: fear, awe, and something deeper. "Teria," Daniel yelled, rushing to her side. "We need to move now." But Teria didn't respond. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand toward the glowing crystal, her movements almost hypnotic. The light from the crystal began to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, casting eerie shadows across the jagged rocks. The air around them grew thick with energy, crackling like a storm about to break. "Teria, snap out of it." Daniel grabbed her arm, pulling her back. The moment their skin touched, a shock of energy surged through him, nearly knocking him to the ground. It wasn't just physical energy, it was mental, emotional. Like the crystal had reached inside him and tugged at something primal. Teria gasped, as if awakening from a deep sleep, her wide eyes filled with confusion. "Captain, what happened?" Her voice was shaky, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "You were in some kind of trance," Daniel said, helping her steady herself. "That thing was affecting you." Teria looked back at the crystal, her expression a mixture of wonder and terror. "I felt it," she whispered, more to herself than to Daniel. "It wasn't just energy. It was speaking." "Speaking," Daniel repeated, glancing warily at the glowing crystal. "What do you mean?" Teria took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "Not in words, but in thoughts. Emotions. It's alive, Captain. This isn't just an artifact. It's a sentient entity. And it recognized me." The weight of her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. A sentient crystal, one that could communicate telepathically? That was beyond anything Daniel had expected to encounter on this mission. And the fact that it had specifically connected with Teria sent a shiver down his spine. Before Daniel could ask more, the ground trembled again, this time more violently. The cracks beneath them widened, and chunks of the rock began to break loose, tumbling down the slope. "Let's go," Daniel ordered, pulling Teria with him as they made a break for the shuttle. They scrambled over the uneven ground, dodging falling debris as the tremors grew stronger. The rest of the crew had already made it to the shuttle, and as Daniel and Teria approached, the hatch opened, welcoming them into the relative safety of the craft. The shuttle pilot, a young woman named Lyra, looked back at Daniel with wide eyes. "Captain, what the hell is going on down there?" Daniel strapped himself into his seat, his heart still racing. "We've awakened something," he said grimly. "Get us back to the horizon now." The shuttle lifted off the ground just as the entire planet seemed to groan beneath them, the landscape shifting and splitting apart. From the air, they could see massive cracks spreading across the surface like a web, with the crystal at the center glowing brighter and brighter, pulsing in time with the tremors. As they ascended, Daniel glanced at Teria, who sat silently next to him, her eyes distant. She hadn't said a word since they escaped the crystal's grasp, but he could see the turmoil written across her face. "Teria," Daniel said softly, leaning closer. "What happened down there? What did you feel?" Teria's gaze remained fixed on the planet below, her voice barely above a whisper. It recognized me as Andralis. My people, we have an ancient connection to energy forms like this. I always thought it was just a myth, a legend passed down through generations. But that crystal, it's alive, and it knew me." Daniel frowned, processing her words. "Why would it recognize you? What connection does your species have to this thing?" Teria shook her head slowly, her silver hair falling across her face. "I don't know, but it felt like it was searching for me, for something inside me." Before Daniel could respond, the shuttle broke through the atmosphere, and the horizon loomed ahead, a safe haven in the cold void of space. As they docked and disembarked, the crew hurried to debrief and analyze the situation, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of something far more dangerous. Back aboard the horizon, the atmosphere was tense. The crew gathered in the briefing room, where the data collected from the crystal was being analyzed. Screens displayed graphs, energy readings, and complex calculations, but none of it made sense. The crystal's energy signature was unlike anything they had encountered, and the fact that it seemed to have some kind of sentience only complicated matters further. Dr. Kellen paced back and forth in front of the main console, his brow furrowed in frustration. "This shouldn't be possible," he muttered, running his hands through his graying hair. "There's no precedent for sentient crystals like this. We're looking at something ancient, something beyond our understanding. Lieutenant Ramirez, standing next to Daniel, crossed his arms, his expression grim. If that thing can affect people the way it affected Teria, we might be dealing with a real threat here, Captain. We need to figure out how to neutralize it. Daniel nodded, his mind racing. He knew Ramirez was right, but something about the crystal gnawed at him. It wasn't just a threat, it was a mystery. And mysteries had a way of pulling him in, no matter how dangerous. Teria stood at the edge of the room, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She hadn't spoken since they returned, but Daniel could tell that she was still deeply affected by what had happened on the surface. He needed answers, and he had a feeling she was the key to unlocking them. After the meeting adjourned, Daniel approached her. "Teria, we need to talk," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of apprehension and determination. "I know," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I have to tell you something, Captain." Daniel led her to a quiet corner of the ship, away from the noise and commotion of the crew. Once they were alone, he turned to face her, his expression serious. "Teria, what aren't you telling me?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. "You said the crystal recognized you. What does that mean?" Teria hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Captain, there's something I haven't told you about my people. The Andralis. We have a connection to energy forms, especially those tied to ancient technology. It's part of our heritage, passed down through generations. But it's more than just a myth. It's real." Daniel listened intently, his mind racing. "And you think this crystal is connected to that heritage?" Teria nodded. "I don't just think it, Captain. I know it. That crystal is part of something much bigger, something ancient and powerful. And whatever it is, it's calling out to me." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "Calling out to you? Why?" "I don't know yet," Teria admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I can feel it. It's like a pull, a connection I can't explain. And I'm afraid. I'm afraid that whatever it's awakening, it's going to change everything." The weight of her words hung heavily between them. Daniel stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. But one thing was clear. They were dealing with forces far beyond their understanding, and Teria was at the center of it. And now, as they stood on the brink of an unknown danger, Daniel realized that the choices they made in the coming hours could determine not only their survival but the fate of the galaxy itself. Chapter 4. Convergence. The soft hum of the Horizon's engines was a comforting backdrop as Captain Daniel Vega processed what Teria had revealed. His mind raced with the implications. The Andralis, her people, were somehow connected to an ancient and powerful energy. This wasn't just a simple exploration mission anymore, it was a race against time to understand the mysterious crystal and whatever lay behind it before it could fully awaken. Teria, standing quietly beside him in the dimly lit corridor, seemed smaller than usual, the weight of her revelation pressing down on her slender frame. For the first time since they'd met, she appeared vulnerable. Daniel couldn't help but feel a mixture of concern and protectiveness for her, emotions that were both unexpected and unsettling given the circumstances. "We have to figure out what that crystal is before it becomes a bigger threat," Daniel said, breaking the heavy silence. "We need more information. You said the Andralis have a connection to ancient energy forms. Do you think there's any historical record, anything we could use to understand this better?" Teria hesitated, her gaze distant. "There are old texts, ancient records, but they're fragmented, kept in sacred places on my homeworld. The Andralis have always guarded our history closely, and much of it has been lost to time." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a deep sadness. "I never believed any of it was real until now." Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. Time was not on their side, and they couldn't simply return to Andralis to search for answers. The crystal was growing stronger, and whatever force it contained was awakening. He needed to think quickly, to make a decision that could avert disaster. "We don't have time to wait for more information," Daniel said, his voice firm. "We need to act. You're the only one who has any real connection to this thing, Teria. If it's communicating with you, if it's calling to you, then we need to figure out what it wants. Can you help us do that?" Teria looked down at the floor, her silver hair cascading around her face. For a moment, Daniel feared she might refuse, that the weight of the responsibility would be too much for her. But then she straightened, her expression hardening with determination. "I'll try, Captain," she said quietly. "But we'll need to return to the surface. I'll have to make contact with the crystal again." Daniel felt a mix of relief and trepidation at her words. Returning to the surface meant diving back into the heart of the danger, but they had no other choice. The crystal was the key to everything, and Teria was the only one who could unlock its secrets. The shuttle descended once more toward the planet's surface, the same barren landscape stretching out beneath them. But this time, the air felt different. The once still and silent planet now seemed to throb with life, as if the very ground beneath them was breathing. The tremors from before had ceased, but there was an eerie calm that filled the air, an unspoken tension that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. Teria sat beside him in the shuttle, her posture rigid and her face pale. Daniel could see the strain in her eyes, the fear she was trying to suppress. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support. "We'll get through this," he said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "I trust you." She glanced at him, her expression softening for a brief moment before she nodded. The shuttle landed near the same rock formation where they had first encountered the crystal. This time, the glowing artifact was pulsing steadily, its light stronger and more intense than before. The atmosphere around it was charged with energy, almost crackling with power. Teria stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate as if approaching a wild animal. Daniel followed closely behind, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his hip, though he knew no conventional weapon could stop whatever force they were dealing with. The rest of the crew remained on standby at the shuttle, monitoring the situation from a distance. Dr. Kellen's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, the energy readings are off the charts. Whatever this thing is, it's growing more powerful by the minute." Daniel acknowledged the message, his attention focused entirely on Teria as she approached the crystal. The pulsing light seemed to respond to her presence, growing brighter and more rhythmic, as though it recognized her. She paused a few feet away from the glowing structure, her eyes locked on it with a mix of awe and fear. "I can feel it again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's reaching out to me." "What's it saying?" Daniel asked, standing just behind her, ready to pull her back if anything went wrong. Teria closed her eyes, her breathing shallow as she concentrated. "It's showing me images, memories, ancient worlds, long forgotten. My people, we were once connected to this energy. We were guardians, protectors of something far greater than we ever knew." Daniel watched her carefully, his heart pounding. Guardians of what? Teria's eyes snapped open, wide with shock. "Of the energy that binds life itself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This crystal, it's part of an ancient network, a power source that once spanned the galaxy. My people were entrusted with its care, but over time, we forgot. We lost our way." Daniel's mind raced. "And now it's waking up. Why?" Teria shook her head. "I don't know, but it's searching for something, for someone to take up the mantle again. It's calling to me because it sees me as a descendant of the Andralis Guardians. It wants me to activate it fully." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Daniel could feel the gravity of the moment. If they activated the crystal, they could unleash a power they didn't fully understand. But if they did nothing, the crystal might continue to grow uncontrollably, potentially causing catastrophic damage to the planet and to the horizon. "Teria, are you sure about this?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. "If you do this, there's no turning back." Teria looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'm not sure of anything, Captain, but I know that if we leave it unchecked, the consequences could be worse." Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of her decision. He placed a hand on her arm, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Teria took a deep breath, steeling herself. She stepped closer to the crystal, raising her hands toward it. The light from the artifact pulsed faster, reacting to her presence. Daniel could feel the air around them vibrate with energy as the connection between Teria and the crystal deepened. And then, with a final pulse of light, Teria touched the crystal. A shockwave of energy erupted from the artifact, knocking Daniel and the crew to the ground. The ground beneath them trembled violently as the crystal's light intensified, bathing the entire area in a blinding glow. For a moment, Daniel feared that they had unleashed something uncontrollable. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the trembling stopped. The light from the crystal dimmed, returning to a soft, steady glow. The air, once thick with tension, now felt calm, peaceful. Teria stood at the center of it all, her hands still resting on the crystal. Slowly, she lowered her arms and turned to face Daniel, her expression one of exhaustion but also quiet triumph. "It's done," she said softly. "I've stabilized the energy. It won't harm anyone now." Daniel approached her cautiously, relief flooding through him. "What about you? Are you okay?" Teria nodded, though she looked drained. "I'm fine. The crystal. It's dormant now. It won't wake again unless someone tries to activate it. But I can feel its power, its connection to me." Daniel looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You did it, Teria. You saved us." Teria smiled weakly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I wasn't alone." For a moment, they stood there in the quiet aftermath, the weight of what had happened slowly sinking in. They had stopped the awakening of an ancient power, but the mystery of the crystal and Teria's connection to it remained. As they made their way back to the shuttle, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever the crystal had been guarding, whatever ancient power lay dormant in the galaxy, it wasn't gone. It was merely waiting for the right moment to awaken once more. And when that moment came, Daniel knew they would have to be ready. Epilogue. Back aboard the Horizon, the crew resumed their mission, but things had changed. The encounter with the crystal had left its mark, not just on Teria but on everyone. They now knew that the galaxy held secrets far more ancient and dangerous than they had ever imagined. In his private quarters, Daniel sat at his desk, staring out at the stars. His thoughts drifted to Teria and the connection she had forged with the crystal. He couldn't help but wonder what the future held for her and for the galaxy. But one thing was certain. They had faced the unknown together, and they had survived. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way. Together.